"Give us the jacket back," my stepfather texted at 11:43 on a Tuesday night. "Your mother needs it for collateral." I read it 3 times. Then I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter, poured myself a glass of water, and stood there in my Nashville apartment listening to the refrigerator hum. Outside, the city went on doing what cities do, indifferent, alive, completely unaware that a single text message had just pulled me 11 years back in time. The jacket was hanging in my closet. Brown leather, slightly scuffed at the left shoulder from the night I wore it out the door and never looked back. I bought it with the first real paycheck I ever earned, not the babysitting cash, not the under-the-table dishwashing money I hid in a shoebox under my bed, but my first actual paycheck from the diner on Route 7 where I waitressed every weekend the summer I turned 18, $240 after taxes. I held that check in the parking lot for a full minute before I cashed it. Then I walked straight to the Goodwill 2 blocks down and spent $63 on that jacket. I wore it home that afternoon. My stepfather was at the kitchen table when I walked in. He looked at me the way he always looked at me, like I was a problem he hadn't figured out how to solve yet. "Where did you get that?" he asked. "I bought it," I said. The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence. The kind that has weight. My mother was at the stove, pretending to stir something that didn't need stirring. "You bought it," he repeated. "With what money?" "My money." He pushed back from the table slowly. My stepfather was not a large man, but he had a way of filling space that had nothing to do with size. He'd married my mother 4 years earlier, when I was 14 and still soft enough to hope that things might get better, that he might turn out to be someone who would at least try. He never tried. "Your money," he said, standing now, "belongs to this household. We have discussed this." We had discussed it, many times. Starting this summer, I turned 16 and got my first job. He had made it clear that any income I earned was a family contribution, not a suggestion, a requirement. $20 here, 40 there, escalating quietly until by the time I was 17, most of what I made went directly onto the kitchen counter on Friday evenings without either of us saying a word about it. My mother watched. She never said anything either. The jacket cost $63. $63 that I had held back from that envelope, that I had earned in the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning clearing tables, while my feet bled inside secondhand shoes. $63 that apparently belonged to this household too. "That money should have come to us," he said. "You want to walk around looking like that? You do it on your own time, in your own house." "This is my house," I said, and I don't know where it came from, that particular sentence. I had never said anything like that before. Something about the jacket, maybe. Something about standing in it. He moved fast. I didn't expect it to be that fast. He grabbed my arm at the elbow and shoved me, not a punch, not exactly, but with enough force that my shoulder hit the doorframe between the kitchen and the hallway so hard that the whole frame shuddered. I slid down a few inches before I caught myself. My mother made a sound. Then she went quiet. He stood over me for a moment, breathing through his nose. "Take the jacket off," he said. I looked up at him. I was sitting half on the floor, my shoulder aching, my mother still at the stove. I didn't take the jacket off. I got up. I walked down the hallway to my room. I picked up my backpack and I put inside it my father's watch, the one my dad had worn every day of his life until the accident when I was 10, the one my grandfather had given me at the funeral and told me to keep safe, and I put in a change of clothes and the shoebox with what was left of my savings, and I zipped it shut. I walked back through the kitchen. My stepfather was sitting at the table again. My mother was still at the stove. Neither of them said a word. I walked out the front door in that leather jacket and I did not go back. I want to be honest about the years that followed, because people always want the story to be cleaner than it was. They want the girl who walked out to immediately become the girl who had it all figured out. I wasn't that girl. I was 18 years old with a backpack and $60 in a shoebox, sleeping on my coworker Priya's couch for 3 weeks before I found a room in a house with 4 other people on the east side of Atlanta, where I'd landed because a bus ticket there was cheaper than anywhere else I'd looked. I worked. That's the whole story of that period. Really, I worked. Waitressing, then a receptionist position at a physical therapy clinic, then slowly, through night classes and weekend studying and years of showing up when I didn't want to, an associate's degree, then a bachelor's, then a job in healthcare administration that actually paid enough to breathe. And I sent money home. I know. I know exactly what you're thinking, because I've thought it too, many times, in the years since. She left, she escaped. Why would she keep sending money to the people who took everything from her? I don't have a clean answer. What I have is this: my mother was still there, and for a long time I believed that if I kept the peace financially, emotionally, at a safe distance, she might eventually leave too. That eventually she would see clearly, that eventually the money would matter less than I did. It was never a lot. $100 here, $200 there, wired on the first of the month like paying a bill. My stepfather never acknowledged it directly. My mother would text a thank you. Sometimes. It went on for 6 years. Then my grandfather got sick. My dad's father, my grandfather, was the person I called from Priya's couch that first week. The person who talked to me for 2 hours about nothing in particular until I stopped shaking. He was 78 by the time I got the call from his neighbor, a woman named Carol who had his emergency contact list because he'd never quite trusted technology enough to update it himself. He'd had a stroke. He was in the hospital in Knoxville. He was asking for me. I drove through the night. I got there in time, which is the only grace I can point to in that whole period. I got there in time, and I sat with him for 4 days, and we talked the way you talk, when you know time is a specific and finite thing. On the 3rd day, he reached over to the bedside table with some effort and handed me an envelope. "I've been meaning to give you this for a while," he said. "Kept thinking there'd be a better time." Inside the envelope was a letter, handwritten on yellow legal pad paper, and a bank statement. I read the letter first. My grandfather explained, in his careful and slightly formal handwriting, that for the past 7 years he had been sending me money, not to my apartment, to a savings account he'd opened in my name at a bank in Knoxville, an account he'd tried to tell me about 3 separate times, by phone, by letter, and once in person at Christmas 4 years prior. I had never received any of those communications. He had assumed, for a long time, that I simply wasn't ready to discuss it, that I was private about money, the way my father had been private about money. He hadn't pushed. But recently, about 8 months before the stroke, he'd done some checking. The letters had been returned. The Christmas conversation he remembered clearly. We'd been in the kitchen, my mother and my stepfather had been there too, and he'd started to bring it up, and my stepfather had interrupted him, and the conversation had moved on, and he'd told himself he'd find another moment. He never found another moment. The account had $34,000 in it. I sat with that envelope in my lap for a long time after he fell asleep. My grandfather passed away 9 days after I arrived in Knoxville. He left me the savings account, officially and legally, through a will that his attorney had been holding for 6 years. He also left a smaller amount to a cousin I'd never met, and his house, with clear instructions that it be sold and the proceeds donated to a veterans organization he'd supported since before I was born. Everything was clean, everything was documented. His attorney, a straightforward woman in her 60s named Miss Patterson, walked me through it in her office the week after the funeral, and I asked the questions I needed to ask, and she answered them precisely. There was nothing my stepfather or my mother could touch. I drove back to Nashville. I'd moved there 2 years prior for a job, and I sat in my apartment for a weekend and I thought about things. I thought about 7 years of birthday letters that never arrived. I thought about Christmas conversations that got redirected. I thought about 6 years of wire transfers. $100 here, $200 there. Money that went into a household that had already taken so much from me and from my grandfather without either of them ever saying a word. I thought about my shoulder hitting that doorframe. I thought about my mother at the stove. Then I called Miss Patterson. I want to be precise here, because the people who notice the inconsistencies in stories like mine are right to notice them. Details matter, and I won't insult your intelligence by being vague. Miss Patterson had already flagged something in reviewing the estate documents. My grandfather had sent 3 certified letters to what he believed was my address, an address he'd gotten from my mother, who he'd called looking for me in the early years after I left. 2 of those letters had been signed for. The signature was not mine. Miss Patterson had a copy of one of the return receipts. We both looked at it for a moment in her office without saying anything specific. Then she referred me to a colleague of hers who handled civil matters. The civil attorney's name was Mr. Okafor, and he was precise and thorough, and not particularly interested in the emotional dimensions of the situation, which was honestly what I needed at that point. He laid out what we had: intercepted certified mail, a forged signature on a return receipt, a 7-year pattern that could be characterized as financial interference. He was careful not to overstate what we could prove. He was also clear about what the exposure looked like from the other side. I called my mother. This was the hardest phone call I have ever made, and I have made some genuinely difficult phone calls in my life. I did not call to yell. I had spent a long time being angry, and it had not gotten me anywhere, and I was tired of it in the specific way you get tired of carrying something heavy for too long. I called because she was still my mother, and I think I will always want this, which is its own kind of grief for her to have some explanation that would make sense of it. She didn't have one. She got quiet in the way she used to get quiet at the stove. She said she hadn't known about the letters. She said a lot of things. And then my stepfather picked up the extension. There was a click, and suddenly his voice was on the line, familiar and flat, and he said that my grandfather had been confused in his final years, and that I shouldn't go making accusations based on the ramblings of an old man. I thanked them both. I told them I'd be in touch. I ended the call. 3 days later, Mr. Okafor sent a certified letter of his own. I won't pretend the legal process was swift or cinematic. It took 8 months. There were letters back and forth. There was a deposition that I attended in person and during which my stepfather was considerably less composed than he'd been on the phone, and there was a settlement conversation that I almost walked away from twice before I didn't. The amount recovered was not everything it never is, but it was real, and it was documented, and it was over. My mother did not leave him. I had stopped expecting her to, somewhere around month 4 of the legal process, when it became clear that her silence was a choice she was making with full information. That grief is different from the grief of losing her to ignorance. It sits differently, but I've learned to carry it. The night the settlement was finalized, I came home to my apartment and I made dinner and I poured a glass of wine and I took the leather jacket out of my closet. I laid it on the bed and I looked at it for a while. $63. A Goodwill find with a scuff on the left shoulder and 2 pockets that don't zip all the way anymore. I've had it relined once, at a tailor on Broadway who told me the leather itself was good quality and would outlast both of us if I took care of it. I thought about what my stepfather had texted. Give us the jacket back. Your mother needs it for collateral. I thought about my grandfather's handwriting on yellow legal pad paper, the careful loops of his letters, the way he'd said, on the 3rd day in the hospital, that he'd been proud of me for a long time and he wanted to make sure I knew it before he couldn't tell me anymore. I thought about the girl who sat on that kitchen floor in $63 worth of secondhand leather and decided, in the space between one breath and the next, that she was not going to take it off. I texted my stepfather back. I kept it short. The jacket isn't available. Neither am I. Please don't contact me again. He responded once, something long and defensive that I read through once and then deleted. My mother sent a separate message 2 days later that I have not opened. I know what I need to know. I know what Miss Patterson's colleague documented, and I know what the settlement agreement says, and I know that my grandfather spent 7 years quietly setting something aside for me because he believed I would need it someday, and he wanted to make sure it was there. I think about that a lot, actually. Not the money, though. The money has mattered, practically and concretely, in ways I'm not going to minimize. I think about the act of it. An old man in Knoxville, opening a savings account, making regular deposits, writing letters that someone else intercepted, trying again, not giving up, believing that eventually the right version of events would find its way to me. He wasn't wrong. There's something people say about stories like mine that the point is the revenge, the moment the scales tip, the settlement check or the legal letter or the whatever it was that finally made the bad people face what they'd done. I understand why people say that. There is something real and necessary about justice. I'm not going to pretend the settlement didn't matter or that I don't feel something specific when I think about my stepfather in that deposition room. But that's not actually the part I think about most. What I think about most is the bus out of Atlanta, the very first one. The Greyhound I took at 6 in the morning with my backpack and my shoebox and my father's watch on my wrist and the leather jacket on my back. I was 18. I didn't know where I was going except away. I sat in the second row because I wanted to see the road ahead of me, and as the bus pulled out of the station, I watched the city fall away in the gray early light, and I thought, this is it. This is where your actual life begins. I was right. It just took a while for the rest of it to catch up. The watch is on my wrist right now, as I tell you this. My dad's watch, The one my grandfather held for me through the funeral when I was 10 years old, the one I've worn almost every day since. It keeps good time. It's a simple thing. Silver face, brown leather band. I've replaced the band twice. Someday I'll replace it again. The jacket is back in my closet. I wear it on days when I need to remember something. I don't need a reason to keep either of them. I don't need to justify what I own to anyone. That took me longer to learn than it should have. And I'm telling you because maybe it'll take you less time if you hear it from someone who came out the other side. The things you earn with your own hands belong to you. The money you make with your own labor belongs to you. Your story belongs to you. Nobody gets to text you at 11:43 on a Tuesday and tell you otherwise. Not anymore. If you've been watching these stories and something in them sounds familiar, the quiet erosion of believing your needs don't matter, the years of sending money you couldn't afford to people who took it without gratitude, the way you can leave a place and still carry it inside you for a decade. I want you to know that the leaving is not the end of the work. It's the beginning of it. The actual work is the slow process of building a life that belongs to you, piece by piece, in apartments and night classes and early morning shifts and phone calls you dread but make anyway, until one day you look around and realize that everything in your home is something you chose. Everything on your walls is something you love, and the person looking back at you in the mirror is someone you actually recognize. That's the victory, not the settlement, not the legal letter, not even the moment you walk out the door. The victory is the Tuesday evening when you're cooking dinner in your own kitchen, in the city you chose, in the apartment you pay for, and you realize you haven't thought about any of them in 3 days. And then you realize something else. You don't actually have to think about them at all. The jacket is in my